It's not like he was your real dad.
That's what my fiancé said, after the funeral, about the only man who ever showed up for me. That was the moment I knew, not just that the wedding was off, but that I had spent 2 years engaged to someone who never really saw me. Not the way Greg did. My name's Riley Evans. I'm 29, live in Minneapolis, work as a full-time copywriter and part-time emotional support human for my rescue dog, Marvin. I grew up in the foster care system, until one man, Greg, showed up and stayed. He wasn't my biological father. He was the man who packed my lunches, taught me how to parallel park, and drove 3 hours to bring me soup when I had the flu in college. But to my ex-fiancé, Dylan, Greg was just some guy. This story isn't about heartbreak. It's about recognizing the difference between someone who loves the real you and someone who only loves the version that fits their life. You're about to hear how I went from planning a wedding to placing an engagement ring on a gravestone. You'll hear how kindness got mistaken for weakness, how silence became complicity, and how walking away was the loudest thing I'd ever done. But more than anything, this is for anyone who's ever been told, "You're too much, you're too emotional, you need to let go." Maybe you don't need to let go. Maybe they just never knew how to hold something that mattered. And if you've ever lived a story like this, if someone once made you feel small for loving too deeply, we want to hear it. There's a link pinned in the comments where you can anonymously share your story. We'll feature voices like yours in upcoming videos, because healing is louder when it's shared. And for every 1,000 views this video gets, we'll donate $1 to organizations supporting foster youth aging out of the system. Your story deserves to be seen, just like mine, and trust me, this one's just getting started. I was 8 years old the first time someone called me a tough case. I didn't know what that meant back then. I just knew I didn't like how it sounded. Like I was a piece of luggage no one wanted to claim. I'd been through 3 foster homes in 10 months. One had ants in the cereal boxes and a bedroom door that didn't lock. One had a woman who smiled for caseworkers and sighed like I was a house guest the moment they left. And one, I stayed in for exactly 4 days, until the husband said I gave him a weird vibe. At 8, I had already learned how to pack my things fast, how to shrink my voice, how to sleep with one shoe on, just in case. So when I first met Greg, I wasn't hopeful. I was tired. He lived in a little brown house in the suburbs outside of St. Paul, with a leaning mailbox and a yard that clearly hadn't been mowed since Clinton was in office. He wore jeans that looked like they'd been through a decade of coffee stains, and his t-shirt said, "World's okayest guitarist." He opened the door and just said, "You must be Riley," like I wasn't a file folder he was reviewing but a person he'd already been waiting for. Inside his house, the carpet was old but clean. There were books stacked in every corner and a guitar leaning against the wall. His fridge was half empty, except for a gallon of chocolate milk, string cheese, and what I later learned was his one signature dish: leftover spaghetti, layered like lasagna and called spagna. That first night, he didn't ask me personal questions. He didn't smile too wide or try to impress me. Instead, he put on a Pixar movie, handed me a blanket, and sat on the far side of the couch. He gave me space. And that, somehow, was the first time I felt like I could breathe. Greg didn't try to fix me. He didn't treat me like a project. He didn't say, "We're gonna be a family now," like so many before him. He just showed up, every day. Same flannel shirt, same dad jokes, same quiet consistency. When I couldn't sleep, he'd leave a nightlight on in the hallway and pretend not to notice when I wandered to the kitchen at 2 a.m. for a cup of milk. When I had night terrors, he didn't rush in to shake me awake. He'd just sit outside my door until I calmed down. He didn't tell me I was safe. He made me feel it. I remember one night, about 6 months after I moved in, I accidentally spilled juice on the carpet. I panicked, froze up, waiting for yelling, punishment, a bag by the door. Instead, Greg walked in, saw the mess, and said, "Looks like the carpet just graduated to abstract art. Let's clean it up." And that was it, no lecture, no sighing, just a paper towel and a joke. I think that's when I stopped holding my breath around him. Still, I didn't call him Dad. Not out of defiance, just caution. That word had weight. I didn't hand it out lightly. Greg never pushed for it, never even brought it up. Until one afternoon, about a year and a half in, I was running late for school. I had a math test I hadn't studied for, my shoes were untied, and I grabbed the wrong lunchbox. The one with sardines he'd packed for his fishing trip. As I rushed out the door, I turned back and said, "Bye, Dad." It just slipped out. Natural, effortless, like I'd been saying it forever. I froze, so did he. We both stood there, staring at each other for a moment. Then he smiled, not big, just that small, warm kind that makes your chest ache, and said, "Bye, kiddo." He never mentioned it again, but after that, everything shifted. We went from foster placement to something that felt real. Permanent, quietly sacred. Greg never adopted me legally. He asked once. I said I needed time. He nodded, said, "Doesn't change a thing." He kept a photo of me in his wallet. Bought me my first car, a 1998 Honda Civic with a cracked cassette deck and a sticker that said "Dogs Welcome, People Tolerated." When I got into college, he cried. I didn't. He cried enough for both of us. He came to my graduation in the same suit he'd worn to his brother's funeral and my high school prom because he only owned one. That man wasn't just my father. He was my sanctuary. He taught me that family isn't made up of blood or paperwork. It's made up of who stays, who listens, who brings chocolate milk and doesn't ask questions when you've had a rough day. Sometimes I think about how easily he could have passed me by. A middle-aged single man taking in a teenage girl? That's not a Lifetime movie plot. That's a paperwork nightmare. But he fought for me. Not loudly. Not dramatically. He just refused to leave. And that kind of love, it's the kind that stays with you, even when the person who gave it doesn't. Which is why, years later, when I watched the man I was about to marry refer to Greg as "not your real dad," something inside me cracked, and finally, stopped trying to mend around people who never really cared to understand. Because if you can't honor the person who gave me a name, a roof, and a reason to believe in people again, you don't get to keep my love. That's not bitterness. That's protection. And I learned it from the best. When I met Dylan, my life was in what people on TikTok call a healing girl era. I had my own apartment with too many throw pillows, a decent job as a copywriter, a rescue dog named Marvin who barked at motivational speakers on YouTube, and a playlist titled Rainy Lofi plus Mild Heartbreak. I wasn't exactly thriving, but I was proud. I had rebuilt a life from scratch, and more importantly, I wasn't looking for anyone to save me. Then came Dylan. He was tall, wore sweaters that looked expensive but slightly itchy, and had a voice that made waiters repeat the specials twice. He worked in marketing and referred to himself on LinkedIn as a brand empathy strategist. At the time, I didn't know that was code for talks a lot without saying much. Still, he seemed kind. He remembered my coffee order. He asked me questions. He didn't interrupt when I told long, winding stories about Greg or Marvin, or the time I accidentally attended a stranger's baby shower because I walked into the wrong airbnb. At first, it felt easy. We dated for over a year before we even used the word serious. He didn't pressure me. He didn't disappear. He cooked, or at least he plated things from Trader Joe's with artistic intent. And I thought maybe this was what calm love looked like. But there's a difference between calm and empty. I first noticed it the night he met one of my closest friends from foster care. Her name's Jess. We'd both aged out of the system around the same time and stayed close ever since. We had dinner, the three of us, and afterward Dylan said, "I didn't realize you still talk to people from that part of your life." That part, like it was a chapter I should have torn out once I had a desk job and a mortgage. I brushed it off. Later, he asked, "So, do you ever think about reconnecting with your biological parents?" I said no. He followed with, "But don't you want answers? Closure?" I told him Greg was my closure. He looked confused. "I mean, Greg's not technically your dad, right?" I didn't answer, I just smiled. The tight kind you give when someone steps on a bruise and then asks why you winced. A few weeks later, after I got quiet during a movie scene involving foster care, he turned to me and said, "I'm not trying to be insensitive. I'm just trying to understand your trauma. And I almost laughed. Because isn't that what everyone says when they want you to make your pain make sense to them? Dylan liked the version of me that was polished, composed, a little quirky but not too heavy. He liked that I was independent, that I had overcome stuff. It made me look strong from a distance. But strength, when it gets too close, starts to feel like complication to people who only want the highlight reel. Dylan didn't want my story. He wanted the story of me, the digestible kind, the one with a happy ending and no messy middle. He wanted to admire the resilience without sitting through the nights I couldn't sleep. The birthdays I never celebrated. The phone calls with Jess where we compared nightmares and laughed anyway. He wanted the woman who had healed, not the woman still healing. And I get it. People like him don't know how to hold weight that isn't theirs. But here's the thing. You can't love someone's light without being willing to sit with their shadow. And every time he looked confused when I talked about Greg or shifted in his seat when I called him Dad, I felt that distance grow. Like I was becoming someone else in his eyes. A version he didn't fully understand and maybe never really tried to. And I kept making myself smaller to keep things peaceful. Until it stopped feeling like love. It started feeling like performance. And I'd been through too much to forget who I was, just to be loved conditionally by someone who thought understanding meant questioning everything sacred to me. The signs were there. I just wasn't ready to name them. Not yet, but I would be. And when I was, I wouldn't just walk away from Dylan. I'd walk toward the truth I had spent my whole life protecting. 2 years, that's how long Dylan and I were together. 2 birthdays, 2 Christmases, at least 4 major fights about laundry. And not once did he meet Greg. It's not like I didn't try. I did. The first time I said, "My dad's making his famous spa Sagna this weekend. Come meet him. Dylan, this quarter's crazy. Can we do it after the rebrand?" Second time, "He's in town for the flea market. You could swing by." Dylan, honestly, I don't know how to talk to old people. It's awkward. Third time, "He sent you a birthday card. Dylan, that's sweet. But kind of intense, right? I've never even met him." And each time, I did what I had learned to do early in life. I made excuses for someone else's avoidance. "He's just busy. He's not great with emotions. He needs time. He grew up differently." But deep down, I knew what was happening. He wasn't rejecting Greg. He was rejecting the part of me that came from Greg. The part that still missed bedtime guitar lullabies. The part that called Greg when my car made a weird noise and WebMD said engine anxiety. The part that knew what it meant to be chosen when no one else had to. Greg wasn't just some guy who happened to raise me. He was the foundation of everything I'd built since. And Dylan, he kept him outside. Like Greg was a footnote, an optional character in the story of us. Even when Greg mailed him cards, handwritten, with dad-level jokes and gift cards for Home Depot, Dylan would just say, "That's sweet," and toss them into a drawer. He never responded, not once. And me, I stayed quiet. Because when you love someone, you want to believe they'll eventually get it. You tell yourself it's just timing, he just doesn't know how much this matters, he'll come around. What I didn't want to see, was that by constantly translating my world into something more palatable, I was slowly losing fluency in my own life. The language of who I was. Because love isn't supposed to require a conversion kit. If someone can't sit at the same table as the man who taught you how to drive, how to fix a leaky faucet, how to say, "I'm sorry," without saying I'm broken, they're not just avoiding the past, they're avoiding your roots. And when you love someone who avoids your roots, you end up building a future in soil that won't hold you. Greg never complained. He kept writing, kept sending Marvin dog treats through the mail with notes that said, "Tell Dylan I said hi again." He never pushed, but I started to shrink. I noticed it in the way I'd soften my voice when talking about foster care, the way I'd skip over stories where Greg was the hero, the way I'd flinch when Dylan called him Greg instead of your dad. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was slowly rewriting my own narrative just to keep someone else comfortable. And comfort built on silence doesn't last. Greg had been nothing but present. Dylan couldn't even be bothered to shake his hand. Somewhere along the way, I'd started choosing a man who made me feel like my past was inconvenient over the man who never once made me feel like I was too much. That's the dangerous thing about being loved conditionally. You start to believe you're only lovable in pieces, the safe pieces, the curated ones, the ones that don't make people shift in their chairs. And I had done enough shifting in my life. I just hadn't said it out loud yet, but I would. Soon, because denial has a short shelf life when someone you love suddenly isn't there anymore. The proposal was perfect. Too perfect, if I'm being honest. A weekend trip to a cabin in Door County, Wisconsin. String lights over a frozen lake. A dinner of baked brie and some overpriced wine Dylan picked because the label looked rustic. There was a vinyl player spinning some obscure indie band with fewer than 800 monthly listeners. It felt like something off a Pinterest board, except with real mosquitoes and a slightly undercooked steak. And when Dylan got down on one knee, I said yes. Not because I didn't have doubts, but because I wanted to believe that this was the moment things would finally align. That whatever quiet grief I'd been carrying about the growing distance between us, between Dylan and Greg, between Dylan and my entire internal universe, would just disappear. That love, once official, would make space for everything that came with me. That night, we sat by the fire. I had Marvin curled up by my feet. I was staring at the ring, imagining telling Greg, not on the phone, no. I wanted to see his face, his exact kind of proud smile, that mix of awkward and overjoyed. I imagined him walking me down the aisle, in his best suit, tie slightly crooked, joking the whole way. I imagined him saying something cheesy like, "Don't trip," or "I'll trip first so it looks intentional." I imagined all the things Dylan had never asked about. Which is maybe why what he said next made the ring feel like it weighed 100 pounds. He took a sip of wine, leaned back and said, "So your dad's invited, right? I mean, of course, I just hope it won't be awkward." That word again, awkward, the same word he used when I asked if he wanted to have lunch with Greg, when I mentioned inviting Greg to a holiday dinner, when Greg mailed him a personalized birthday card with a doodle of Marvin. I looked at him, really looked at him. Dylan wasn't smiling. He wasn't even meeting my eyes. He was doing that thing where he threw a joke out like a net, hoping it'd either land soft or give him cover if it didn't. And suddenly, something clicked. While I'd spent the last hour picturing Greg standing next to me in a moment I thought we were building together, Dylan had been planning how to position him out of the frame. He didn't want Greg there to witness our beginning. He wanted him managed. Quiet, distant, controlled, because to Dylan, Greg was a variable, an asterisk, a footnote in a story he was trying to write with clean lines and no emotional backstory. But I couldn't be edited like that. Not without erasing the man who made this version of me possible. It wasn't even a fight. There was no yelling, just a subtle, seismic shift in the foundation of what I thought was a future. Because I didn't want a wedding where the man who gave me a home wasn't celebrated. And I didn't want a marriage with someone who thought love meant curating the guest list around his discomfort. I didn't say any of this out loud, not yet. But as I crawled into bed that night, I stared at the ceiling and realized this proposal might have been wrapped in candles and indie folk charm, but it had a hollow center, a pretty shell with a silence I couldn't unhear. And something in me, small but real, started to pull back the thread. I always thought I'd have more time. With Greg, that is, he wasn't old. He wasn't sick. He still played the same 3 guitar chords every Sunday and sent me blurry photos of Marvin merch he found at farmers markets. The last time we talked, he reminded me to check my tire pressure and asked if Dylan was treating me like someone who deserved quiet mornings and loud laughter. That was his thing. Greg never gave relationship advice. He just reminded me what love was supposed to feel like. Then, one morning, the phone rang. It was Jess. Her voice cracked on my name, and before she even said the words, I felt the air leave my lungs. Greg had a stroke. He didn't make it. I couldn't speak. I sat in the middle of my kitchen floor, in my pajamas, clutching Marvin like he was the only thing anchoring me to the room. The man who taught me how to exist was just gone. Everything after that came in pieces. Flowers, a suit I couldn't zip, people asking me what kind of service he would have wanted. I couldn't answer. I couldn't think. Dylan booked our flights. He said, "You don't have to do this alone." I nodded, thinking maybe this was when he'd show up. He didn't. He arrived at the funeral late, blamed a delayed Uber, didn't meet my eyes, didn't say, "I'm sorry." He sat in the back row, scrolled through his phone like the silence between eulogies was inconvenient. And when it was over, when I was still standing at the edge of the casket, barely breathing, trying not to collapse, he came up behind me and said, "At least you guys had time. Some people lose real parents much younger. Real parents, not your dad, not Greg, not I can't imagine what this feels like for you. Just a clean, clinical dismissal of everything Greg had ever meant." I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I just turned to look at him, and in that exact moment, I knew the engagement wasn't just fragile. It was finished. Because you can't love someone and belittle the grief that made them. You can't share a home with a person and still be a stranger to what shaped their soul. Dylan didn't just fail to show up. He erased the man who'd been there when no one else was. He minimized the pain I couldn't even describe out loud yet. And for the first time since Greg passed, I felt something other than grief. I felt clarity. The kind that comes not with anger, but with quiet finality. The kind that whispers, "You know now. You know who stood by you, who saw you, and who never truly cared to." I left the service with my heels in my hand and my heart in pieces. But somewhere, buried under the heartbreak, was the beginning of a decision. I just hadn't said it out loud yet, but I would. Because the next part of this story didn't need noise, it needed closure. The cemetery emptied slowly, like people were afraid to be the first to leave or the last to stay. I stayed. I sat cross-legged on the damp grass, not caring about the dress I'd borrowed or the ache in my feet. I stayed long after the condolences faded, the flower petals settled, and Marvin curled up beside me like he knew this silence mattered. Greg's headstone was simple. Just his name, his birth and death dates, and one line he'd asked for: "Show up, stay, be kind." 3 things, everything he ever believed in. I whispered a few things I hadn't said out loud yet, that I missed his bad jokes, that Marvin still hated baths, that I hadn't figured out how to breathe yet, that Dylan, well. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't turn, I didn't need to. Dylan sat down, not close, not far. Just enough to make sure I knew he was there. For a few moments, we were quiet. I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd finally say something real. But then he spoke. "You should probably start letting go," he said. "Greg wouldn't want you to hold on like this. I mean, it's not like he was your real dad." There it was, again, that word real. Like everything Greg gave me didn't count. Like the meals, the laughter, the years of safety and presence were just placeholder parenting. Like I was mourning something imaginary. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just looked down at my hand. At the ring. It sparkled in the overcast light, all quiet promises and careful planning. But it felt wrong now. Foreign, like I was wearing someone else's future. I slipped it off. No drama, no speech. I stood, walked to Greg's headstone, and gently placed it at the base, next to the photo of us fishing when I was 10, the one where my braid was crooked and Greg's hat was on backwards. It wasn't about theatrics. It wasn't revenge. It was the clearest moment of honesty I'd had in a long, long time. Because if you can't honor the man who gave me a name and a home, you'll never understand how I love. Not just who I love, but how, with loyalty, with depth, with roots. And Dylan, he wanted a version of love that didn't come with backstory. A sanitized kind, convenient, curated, but I had learned the real kind. The kind that stays through silence and grief. That sits in hospital rooms. That makes mistakes and shows up again anyway. I looked at Dylan one last time. He didn't say anything. Just stared at the ring like he'd lost something that was never really his. And in that moment, I felt a strange kind of peace. I wasn't angry. I wasn't heartbroken. I was free. And freedom, I learned, doesn't always feel like celebration. Sometimes it feels like quiet release. Like stepping out of a version of yourself that was too small, too polite, too willing to be misunderstood. That ring had never really belonged on my finger. because I'd spent too long trying to fit into someone else's idea of what love should look like. Now, I was ready to love in my own language, starting with the man who taught it to me. I didn't make a scene. I didn't ask for my ring back or storm off with Marvin under one arm and closure in the other. I didn't wait for Dylan to say something meaningful or chase after me with an apology wrapped in panic. I just left, not because I was being brave, but because there was nothing left in that conversation worth staying for. He didn't call. I didn't text. There was no dramatic breakup post, no shared Spotify playlists being deleted in passive-aggressive silence. Just the quiet, wide-open ending of something that had already emptied itself long before the ring came off. I drove home in silence. Marvin fell asleep in the passenger seat like he knew it was over too. When I got back, the apartment felt smaller somehow, but safer. Like I had shut the door on a draft that had been blowing through me for months. I kicked off my shoes, made a grilled cheese, and let myself cry exactly twice. Then I sat on the floor, because for some reason heartbreak feels more manageable when you're not at eye level with functioning furniture. That's when I saw it. A padded envelope by the door. No return address. Inside was a canvas, wrapped in brown paper and bubble wrap. I peeled it open and just stared. It was a painting. Watercolor, soft colors. Familiar shapes, me, Greg, Marvin, sitting together on the porch of Greg's house. I was maybe 16. Greg had a mug in one hand and a sandwich in the other. Marvin looked way younger, less grumpy. At the bottom corner, a tiny, neat signature. Eliza. Eliza was a girl Greg and I had once mentored through a foster youth arts program. She was 14 back then, shy, all knees and backpack zippers. Greg had bought her first set of real brushes. He must have commissioned it months ago, before the stroke, before the proposal, before I even knew I needed this reminder. Underneath the painting was a note, in Greg's handwriting. Thought this might belong somewhere safe. Love, Dad. I sat there holding it, not crying now, just breathing, because that's what closure actually is. It's not always civil. It's not always a neat handshake or a heartfelt apology from the person who hurt you. Sometimes, closure is a door you close from the inside. Sometimes, it's a quiet decision to stop translating your pain for people who never intended to listen. To stop softening your story so someone else can stay comfortable inside it. Sometimes, closure is a painting from someone who believed in your worth long before you did. And sometimes, it's grilled cheese on the floor with your dog and finally, not having to explain why your grief doesn't need approval. I didn't call Dylan to tell him. I didn't send him a final text. I just kept the painting, hung it above my desk, next to Greg's old guitar and the photo of me graduating college while he stood in the crowd with binoculars even though we were in the fourth row. That's where the story really ended for me, not with Dylan, not with the ring, but with the reminder that I was never too much. That I never had to apologize for the depth of my love, the strength of my roots, or the man who taught me what home really meant. A week after I left the ring at Greg's grave, Dylan texted me. I was just trying to protect you from holding on to pain. I didn't reply, because I didn't need to explain that Greg wasn't the pain. Losing him was. Greg was never what hurt. What hurt was loving someone who couldn't tell the difference. The truth is, I think Dylan meant it. In his own detached, spreadsheet heart, he thought what he was doing was helpful. But peace doesn't come from people who need you to erase yourself to keep things comfortable. Peace comes when you stop translating your grief. When you stop waiting for validation from someone who never had the language to understand you in the first place. So I turned my phone off and turned my life back on. I moved out of the apartment I'd shared with Dylan, too many white walls, too many curated coffee table books. I moved into Greg's house, the one with the leaning mailbox, the broken porch step he never fixed because it kept salesmen humble, and the water heater that had an attitude. I unpacked slowly. Hung the watercolor painting from Eliza in the hallway. Set up Greg's old guitar in the living room corner. Put Marvin's bed where it always used to be. And one night, I sat at Greg's kitchen table with a blank notebook and I started writing. Not emails, not grocery lists. A memoir, just page one at first. then a memory, then another. Not all of it was about Dylan. Most of it was. It was about foster care, about showing up, about Greg, about all the quiet ways people rescue each other without saying the word rescue. And in the stillness, something surprising happened. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt mine, fully, authentically, like I belonged to myself again. For so long, I had been trying to earn space in someone else's life. Now, I was learning how to occupy my own. There were no big revelations, no perfect mornings, just Marvin snoring beside me, a cup of coffee that tasted like home, and the knowledge that I didn't need to be someone else's version of worthy. I was enough. I didn't need closure from Dylan. I didn't need to make peace with him, because I had made peace with myself. Not every ending needs to be clean. Some just need to be true. And the people who leave, they're not always a loss. Sometimes they're just making space for the parts of you that were waiting to return. I used to think stories like mine were sad, that if the word dad didn't come from biology, it came with an asterisk, that if a relationship didn't last, it meant I failed to love it the right way. That grief was only real if the world around you said, yes, that counts. But here's what I know now. Greg was my dad, not by blood, but by presence. By breakfast for dinner on Thursdays and sitting through school plays even when I forgot my lines. By showing up, staying, and never making me earn the love he gave freely. Dylan was never the villain in this story. He was just a mirror, one that reflected who I still thought I had to be, palatable, shrinkable, easy to understand. But the truth, I didn't lose a fiancé. I buried the last illusion that I had to shrink to be loved. And from that moment on, I stopped apologizing for my story, for my grief, for loving deeply, loudly, without a disclaimer. This isn't a sad story. It's a story that ends in knowing who you are, where you came from, and who made you believe you were worth showing up for. Now, I want to invite you to do something. Tell us who gave you your name, who made you feel safe, who stayed. Whether they were blood or not, whether they're still here or only live in memory, tell us. There's a link pinned in the comments where you can share your story, anonymously, truthfully, powerfully. Every voice deserves to be heard. And for every 1,000 views this video receives, we'll donate $1 to organizations supporting foster youth transitioning into adulthood. Because everyone deserves a home, even if it's just in someone else's heart. Your story matters. And this won't be the last one we tell. We're building something here, a library of healing, a record of what love really looks like, messy, imperfect, loyal to the bone. So if you've ever felt invisible, too complicated, too much, you're not alone, you're just getting closer to it. And when you do, you'll realize it was never about who stayed in the end. It was about who showed you your worth from the start.